Good morning, beautiful people of the internet, and welcome once more to the Sunday special live. As you can see, we are just the Thorns. There is no Rose. Helen has the day off, and we have replaced her, not too shoddily, with Saif Derzi, as always, joined by Adam Lawrence, Piotr Rusinek, and myself, Jay Howard. Saif has got a really good subject to pick up on, so we'll probably kick off with that. Give us our 13% of the call, and then we'll hand over to Adam for the other 87%. So, Saif, what is it you've been looking at this week?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, it's the only chance I'm going to get to speak, so I'm going to take it wisely, I guess. First of all, I've actually been summoned to this call to act as a gatekeeper for the timing. So
yes,
I don't think we've got to finish on time today. There we go. And coming back from Japan, it's just amazing how on time they are, and every single thing works like absolute clockwork. So that was amazing to see how everything is done through a system and a process. And yeah, they're just very, very respectful of everyone's time, which is amazing. But yeah, so I guess the topic, and the reason why I'm picking up on this as well even further, is because I saw someone on TikTok posting, get every single penny out of the bank, look at all these cheap properties in Peterborough, and it was all the Allsop properties. It was tongue-in-cheek for TikTok, right? But the comments, they got hounded by, this is just a guide price, it's not an actual sales price, etc. But the reality is, and this is a real key reminder for everyone, is the fact that over the last couple of years, we had a lot of, big institutions buying up stock at what I think was extremely overvalued, because there was a bit of paper saying that this is going to be the rent and this is how long the rent's going to be paid for, blah, 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 and all the rest of it. And it's public knowledge, but basically an institution called Homebrew has effectively had all of, I think the majority of their tenants have now gone to administration, and their tenants being CICs, so charitable organisations, which basically were housing certain people and getting paid by local councils and government. So the interesting thing is Allsops has, correct me if I'm wrong, Piotr, but they're running it over 3 days and they've got around 500 properties.
Yeah, they've got 1 day in a hotel and 2 days as a live stream.
Yeah, but
505.
The interesting thing is, so it's not, I thought it was receivership. It's not gone into receivership yet. It's asset managers that are acting on their behalf to dispose of this stuff. But I mean, the guide prices are, from what I've seen, around 30% of what they've paid for these properties only 1, 2, 3 years ago, basically. That's the interesting thing. And Allsops don't mess around. Their guide and their reserves are within 10% of each other. So they will let it go within 10% if they have to. So yeah, just interested to hear what other people have to comment about this, because I've got my own comments on it as well.
Yeah, actually, I think Allsop started doing this about a year or year and a half ago, where they put the guide price where the reserve is. So usually the reserve is not above the guide price. Yeah, I doubt those properties will sell for anything more than 30, 35, 40% of what these people paid for. No one is paying anywhere close to those asset prices.
I think you probably need to be quite careful at distinguishing where the mistake is as well, or where the arbitrage is, if you like, because, when you are, what people, and I see this all the time, it's a mistake that people make. I first saw it sort of manifest, I suppose, in HMO, where the investors wouldn't really admit this at all, but this was what I was hearing, and this is what I repeated back to people. I've got some cash savings, normally ended up, for whatever reason, always being 100k. Got 100k savings, and the reality is they were happy if they could turn that into £1,000 a month cash flow. Now, 1% a month return, when you think about it like that, and you own an asset, not bad. There were so many problems with that philosophy, such as they didn't mind if on that mentality, you wouldn't mind leaving 100 grand in a deal that makes you £1,000 a month. Now, problems that have surfaced recently on that front. Number one, what happens when the interest rate goes up? Number two, what happens when the running costs go up? Right? Even setting those aside, how do you properly assess an investment that, because quite a lot of these, you might end up being 400k into something that bricks and mortar's worth 350, right? So in my world, you've lost 50 grand on day one, plus frictional costs, right? So your first 50 months of £1,000, if life is as smooth as all that, which we know it generally tends not to be. So the first 4 years and 2 months, you're going to recoup your first 50 grand that you've lost on the asset value, right? Now, let's say the asset value creeps forward at a few % a year, but you've effectively done what is the absolute equivalent to a bond that's trading above par. So you've paid 120 for a bond that will pay you back 100 when it matures, right? Now, luckily, that underlying 100 is hopefully inching forward over time, and that helps out. But you have to assess these things in that way. And then I saw this manifesting itself a lot more in the social housing space when people would try and sell properties, particularly in the northeast and the northwest, for vastly above their bricks and mortar value, but at a 7 or 8% yield. Now, lots of people have had success selling lots of those properties. And the key question the investor hasn't asked themselves is, why is this 100 grand 2-bed terrace in Oldham, not to pick on Oldham, but you've got to pick on somewhere, right? Why is this trading at 180 grand? Because it's got a lease inside it paying 15 grand a year. And then it starts to look disastrous because you've actually paid 80% more than the bricks and mortar value. So if you want to look at home REIT, you can take that to a whole nother level where they might have paid 300 for that 2-bed terrace because the lease was so good. And as I said, the underlying covenants, it reminds me quite a bit of a 2008 style situation, because the excuse is, oh, nobody really understood the strength of the underlying asset or the underlying lease or the underlying covenants. And I'm afraid I don't believe that. I don't agree with it. I think something's gone on somewhere where a lot of money has leaked out of the system into a few pockets. Whether that will be criminally investigated, as per 2008, is anybody's guess. But
this is CDO 2.0, isn't it? Because you've got the big aggregators that have taken loads of this stock with lots of different leases, lots of different covenants, and these the guys that were going to pull the trigger from Home REIT's point of view needed to deploy those funds, so they had targets, they had to work on the targets. And we were just over a year ago, we were in an environment where you could not get return on your money. So for these guys, they were thinking, even at 4 or 5% net yield, they were hitting their targets. And at the end of the day, they're going to be out of the job, but they're not going to lose their money at the end of the day. So that's the kind of situation that happened with this. No one was checking things. There was no surveyor surveying these properties. They had to retrospectively say, now we're going to go out and get surveyors once shit hit the fan, right? So clearly they were just not paying, good gatekeepers. But what I took away from this is somewhat slightly different. What I took away from this was, and this is for everyone listening to kind of understand, is something is valued to someone at something, and it can be valued to someone else at totally different. It could be at 3, 4, 5 times multiplier, right? So if you go and list your company on an IPO in the stock exchange in Dusseldorf, for example, or let's just say, for example, S&P 500 in New York, or America specifically, you might get 3, 4, 5 times multiplier based on just because it's in a different environment, people will be willing to pay more and value it higher. So I think for people to understand, this is why property can be valued at one thing to a cash buying company, another thing to a retail buyer that's buying it as an end user and going to take their time and go through the general sort of mortgage, but then also an auction. So people need to understand the value is different to different people according to the conditions. And that's why this word B&V is touted around, and it's like people really frown upon it. It's not about the fact that it's below market value. It's just value to someone at that point because they can complete quickly in cash. And I just think that's a really good point for people to take away, is things are valued to different people at different prices.
Yeah,
and I also think another thing to learn from this is like how availability of money affects prices of properties, because in the past, where the interest rates were 0.5% or whatever 1%, people could afford to pay whatever money because you could justify it by getting this small return, 3-4%, but still 3-4 times more than what people were paying for in interest. Now, when the interest rate is 6%, that lack of availability of the money affects the prices of the properties, because and also that goes on top of the leases that were broken and the tenants that gone bust. But all this kind of has an effect on prices in a massive way. So it's a double lesson, I guess. It
is, and that's something that goes well beyond Allsops and Home REIT. and all the rest of it, and goes into the whole of the wider marketplace at the moment. You know, there's some of the bits I put in the supplement this week around what percentage of people, landlords, are holding stock that are unencumbered. You know, ultimately, first of all, you've got to distinguish the conversation between the existing marketplace and new stock in the pipeline, right? And that's important in the first place to understand the difference. But in terms of new stock, if you're a cash investor and for 15 years you've been looking and thinking, right, I've been in the game 30 or 40 years, right? I've got an unencumbered portfolio. I've grown it steadily by buying more stuff in cash when I've had profits to redeploy, right? For the last 15 years, I haven't had a singular choice on that money that I've liked the look of. I don't like the stock market. It's not for me. I don't understand it. I don't trust all the people that Saif just said sometimes value things 5 times as highly in America as they might do in Germany or whatever. Don't understand it. Don't get involved in it. The only thing I understand is property. I used to like the idea of putting cash in the building society, for example, but I didn't have the cash back then. I was investing it in my portfolio and I was growing it. Now, if I go to Recognized Bank or whatever, I can get 5.75 on a 5-year bond, right? And although I haven't heard of them, it's protected by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. So I can put 85k in there and 85k in there in my partner's name and still sleep at night on that. So actually, unless I'm getting property really cheaply, maybe I'm not going to deploy that into property. And then that's the sort of retail investor viewpoint who've got cash potentially. That filters all the way up through to, as you say, the people who are standing on the back of people's necks at home to deploy capital when they say, hold on, can we deploy today? Because what's our 5 or 10 year forecast for outer London or Birmingham or pick wherever, Nottingham, pick wherever you like, right? Okay, what's the risk-free rate of return? Well, they might look at the base rate. They're probably more likely to look at the 1 year UK gilt yield as the traditional risk-free rate of return. That's up in the 5s still at the moment, the low 5s. So what premium over and above that 5-ish% am I going to receive by investing in this property over the next 10 years? Because we can't predict what's going to go on from years 11 to 20. It's near impossible. 10 years is hard enough. And when you look at some of the forecasting that's out there, it seems that 12 months is hard enough for people to even remotely predict accurately. So why are they going to deploy in build to rent, this, that, the other? What does that really mean? Well, it means that stock gets squeezed even further, right? Availability of stock gets squeezed further. Organic wastage happens. Landlords drop out the market because of age, because they get tired, because they want to cash in, because they're moving out the country, whatever, right? But the swathe of those who sort of grew up in the post 1988 Housing Act boom and bought reasonably well until 2000, and then maybe went crackers and bought hundreds between 2002 and 2007 because the credit availability was so wide open. You know, just by definition of, forget every other discussion around them, if you bracket those people by age, they are between 55 and 85, 90, right? So they're inevitably at a point where they don't need to grow anymore, they don't want to grow anymore, or they're at a point where they've absolutely milked the cow so hard over the years that they took all the money when it was easy money interest rates and they were paying base plus a half. They enjoyed the spoils of war. Now they're paying 7.25 and there's no money. And not only is there no money, there's no money to pay agents. There's no money to do any maintenance. There's no money because stuff isn't yielding more than 7.25 because they haven't put their rents up. And 7.25 is a very healthy yield before the start of this year, where things really started to rebalance and prices started going down and rents carried on really surging forward. You know, that's the first yield adjustment we've seen in favor of yields being more positive for about 15 years, if not longer. So the structure of the market at the moment is just fascinating because it constricts all the supply. And nobody really, it saddens me in a way because all the people who are on the tenant side, if you like, and I try and be as objective as possible because I just don't see any other, there's no point putting sugar on pills, you know, it is what it is. But all the people on the tenant side don't understand this argument, don't see it coming, don't understand what might be able to be done to solve it. They instead focus on ideological perspectives to attack landlords because you shouldn't own and control houses at the extreme end, or evictions in order that people can put rent up. It's much more likely to be the other way around, where rent has gone up and it's had to go up because of increased cost pressures, and then people can't afford it, and then that leads to eviction. Now that's likely, but something like 84% of Section 21s are issued on the basis of rent arrears when you ask landlords when they're surveyed, and then a lot of the rest of those are issued because landlords want to sell property. Yeah. So this idea of people get evicted because the landlord wants to put the rent up, it's just an ideological fantasy that distracts everyone from the real point. So I'm still hanging out for that gig where I get to debate with Shelter or whatever. So I look forward to when the bell tolls on that one. But it's a tough market for a tenant, and it's going to be an amazing market for the landlord that stays in and can deal with these structural problems and has got their financial structure sorted. But it's not easy to do that, and it's not mega lucrative at the moment. Margins are squeezed to nearly nothing.
I think the key there, Adam, with that is, and I think all the landlords out there should, even if they're on a 3% 5-year fix, for example, which is going to drop off in, say, 3 years, they need to have the mindset that they're actually on 6% right now. And they need to be acting like they're on 6%, because if their rents are not covering that from now, well, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot, because you can average it out over the next 3 years and you can manage that tenant's expectations. And I think the worst thing we see is the old school landlords, I've not put the rent up because they're a good tenant. That's great, but the reality is you're just shooting yourself in the foot. And also you're causing a problem for that tenant, because that tenant's lifestyle is now fit with that rent. So when they realize either you sell the property, we serve them a section, or they come to the realization when you sell the property to someone else and they take it over that this is the market rent, they can't afford it because their lifestyle has been built around £400 my rent, where market rent is actually £750, £800 nowadays. So I think actually what we can do as a favour to the tenants, and I know it sounds counterintuitive, is put the rents up incrementally year on year, slowly and gradually in a fair way, but actually because it forces the tenants to basically budget better. Simple as that. I think
you'll struggle to persuade most people it's a favour. That is probably a bridge too far, my friend. But your logic is absolutely sound, and I 100% agree with that. And that's very much a drum that I've banged myself. And when you transfer that situation to the owner occupier, right, that's exactly the same. So they were stress tested at 5.5% on their mortgage. They're paying 2%. Whoop-de-doo, right? You could afford 5.5% because that was the assessment. What did you do with that money you saved on that 3.5% of that 250 grand loan, or whatever the average loan is, right, for a first-time buyer? Did you A, Uber Eats, B, and the lifestyle, and it's the same squeeze that people are feeling. And when you look at the Bank of England figures of the stuff I talked about a couple of months ago, when they were saying about £200 a month was the average increase they were expecting for the average owner-occupier mortgage holder, that's not dissimilar to the average rent increase over the past. Well, if you use the new rents as a guide, now of course you've still got lots of landlords who are. Your advice for people who are 3 years out is absolutely bang right, and if they don't do what you've said, they will be broke. It's not profiteering on the back of low rates. It's organising your business for 2025, 2026, 2027, whenever these rates drop off for you, right? You need to be prepared for that new world. Now, on the bright side, you would bet diamonds that when they come to drop off in 2026, in your example, that the rates will be a bit lower than they are today. But the problem with that is, notice my emphasis on a bit lower than they are today, because what I'm now seeing is conversations are now normalized, right, around, oh, well, this one's 5.25% with a 7% fee. And I'm like, is no one concerned about this 7? That's 7, right? So we were paying 1, 1.5, 2. You used to think that's a bit punchy. 7, right? And if you're not careful, and I've had this with a few deals I've stacked over the last sort of 10 days or so, I'm like, risky. There's equity. There's a parachute of even if the market went down considerably from here, which I deem extremely unlikely, but if it did, like, there's still a cushion in there. But here's what I'm going to take out the deal. Here's how long I'm going to have to wait for the deal. Here's how much the bridging company and the bank are going to take out the deal. Oh, conclusion, I may as well apply for a job at the bank if I'm going to do that deal, right? Because I don't work for the bank, and I'd be better off applying for a job for the bank because the risk I'd be taking would be way, 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 way smaller. So I think you're dead right. People should go and assess where they are at today's interest rate is 100% correct.
But Adam, unless you're a trader, the equity over the next 6 to 12 months means nothing. It's all about cash flow. It's all about free cash flow, actually. And that's the most important thing, because as you're saying as well, as in you're bagging on about, we are getting closer to the peak. When I say the peak, I mean the peak of pain, basically, for a lot of people, right? Interest rate peak and everything else. So I think if people can't hang on in the next 6 to 12 months, which is probably the most important point over this next period, then you're not going to be able to make it over the next couple of years. But it's really, really critical. And the only way you can make it is free cash flow. It's as simple as that. Cash flow is everything in the next couple of months. But on your point as well about the favour is not to serve the Section 21, just to be really clear.
You're not going to get. I can't have it. I'm sorry, I can't have it. But I think obviously cash flow is the thing that sends every business bust, and that always needs to be, or at least 90% plus of businesses are wound up because of cash flow, and that's always been my number one consideration since 2011 when I started looking at this in a serious way. And you can see where the numbers are at the moment, and you can see where we know from our own portfolio in terms of what we have to spend on maintenance and where that takes us. And if you start, and we pride ourselves on not doing works, which I know a lot of longer, older portfolio landlords, some of these creaking ones, especially when they skinned all the money out of it in 2007, they haven't been doing work. And stupid as it sounds, every night we go to bed, those properties get 1 day older. That roof gets 1 day older. Those windows get 1 day older. And I always remember a conversation with a friend of mine from uni who he worked in distressed assets for one of the very big banks during the GFC, worked in there till about 2012, and his niche team was 5 million to 25 million commercial property distressed. And I talked him through my philosophy. This was years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. And he said to me, if people in the commercial property market had your philosophy, they wouldn't have got into the trouble that they did. But you see it all the time. And I see it at the coalface where people are thinking, right, what do you see when you see someone breathe some new life into a commercial building, let's say, right? Pick a pub for the sake of, because pubs get refurbed, don't they? And since smoke, the industry as a whole feels a bit like Toys R Us, right? When the internet came along, it's walking dead stuff. Youngsters don't drink as much as they used to. There aren't as many entrants into it, but the model has changed. So actually eating out seems to be becoming more and more popular and becoming more continental as a country. So actually people will go out. What they won't do necessarily is rock up to the boozer at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, stay for 7 pints, because these days that's about 45 quid a night and no one can afford it. But what they might do is go out and have a meal and 2 drinks, and the margin on those 2 drinks might be nearly as much as the margin on having 6 or 7 pints, and that's the way the business model's evolving. So there's 2 ways to look at it. You've got the buildings that are creaking, that people aren't putting any money into, that need operators whose skill level is above the average operator you're going to get in a building like that. Or you get someone come along, a pubco, for example, who knows what they're doing, who knows if we put £1 million into this building, we will see a massive spike in revenue, and that revenue will trail over a number of years. And then what they've started doing, which I think is quite clever, is that we'll do a mini refresh, which basically means we close on Sunday early evening when we do no trade anyway. We close for Monday, not a bad night of the week to be closed unless you're a student pub, and we reopen on Tuesday. But we promote, it's more of a marketing exercise. We move a couple of pictures and put a couple of extra logs in the fireplace or whatever, but we'll promote it. And it'll spike the interest of a number of people in the locale who will come and visit. And we'll do this, that, and the other. And we'll change the menu, and we'll do this, and we'll do that. And so you've got sort of it's almost dichotomous. Do you know what I mean? There's either do nothing, desperately sweat the asset until it falls over, or big capex up front, solid investment return. But the problem is the people who go for the latter then tend to fall into the trap of, well, we spent £1 million on that 14 years ago. And this is the rack mentality, right? That concrete's supposed to last 30 years. How long's it been in there? Oh, 55 years. Did anyone have any concerns? Did no one use the Google Calendar? I mean, I appreciate 55 years ago there was no Google Calendar, but you know what I mean? You know, we got used to that with all the prefabs. We often see the prefabs when you drive around Birmingham that, you know, were supposed to be up, I think it was about 20 or 30 years. And some of them are still standing today. And some of them are listed, of course. But are they structurally the greatest buildings in the world? Is lending easy to get on them? It's a different kettle of fish altogether. They're a bit of an alternative to a bit of an alternative housing in a way that wouldn't be allowed to be built these days, which gives you more problems in terms of replacement.
And breathe. Wow, that was something.
Brilliant. Well, I'm like really curious when we're talking about the home REIT and all of the social housing companies, because I guess home REIT is not the only company that has trouble because of the underlying tenants going bust, and we hear so much about those social housing providers going bust, and I wonder what's happening with all those tenants that were housed by the social housing people, because if there's so many of them appearing to go bust, like what the council doing with the tenants that they had, because they had such a massive list of people they had to house. And what do you guys think is happening? Is the list growing? Are the councils going to normal providers? I don't know, like Serco or all the other kind of usual
the usual suspects.
We're using usual suspects, yeah.
What you'll find on a lot of these, Piotr, is a lot of them have been trashed. A lot of them have been boarded up, because whether there was even tenants in there in the first place, or whether they've just signed up people, you know, by name, for example. So I don't actually think a lot of these had actually had tenants. And I know some of them where I know the management companies that were managing them as well previously when they then got handed over. And they say, and they've been keeping eyes on a lot of them, they don't think there's even people that have been moved into some of these. It's just, it's your typical Mickey Mouse contracts. Not on all of them, I'm just saying from the ones that I know personally.
I think if any film producers watching, there's a chance for the property version of The Big Short here. Without a shadow of a doubt, get the documentary done on what's happened on Home REIT without a shadow. I think, Piotr, what you've laid out there is what would happen in a normal environment. Absolutely. You look at even, you know, the news around Birmingham City Council and you know, bankruptcy because of equal pay failures. Let's call them, to be generous. Even in those situations in bankruptcy, the vulnerable are protected. That's part of the conditions of the technical bankruptcy. So it's not where the money's not there or the money's stopped in order to house people. But Mr. M Mouse and Mr. D Duck probably lived in Florida rather than in one of those properties that Saif's talking about. So they never needed housing again in the first place anyway. So that's but generally speaking, in a more traditional situation, the housing association or the council will draft a provider in. And of course, if there's a big problem, they go for one of the big boys, not because they can sort it out, but they're the only ones who could theoretically sort it out. And, you know, these days there's only about 4 or 5 companies tendering normally. And some of the asylum contracts are insane. You know, they say things like, as many people as arrive, you pick up, basically. So if one of these human traffickers built like a super raft that got 100,000 people over in one go, you know, it would be down to whoever's got that contract, Serco, I think, on the south coast, to sort that out, which would be impossible because they wouldn't be able to. And then you would see what you've already seen, which is overspill of housing into boats, hotels, military bases, whatever else, you know.
So when Netflix comes to us and they want to start the Big Short UK version, Michael Berry, with the snippets from the Sunday special from 3 years ago, I was telling everyone this.
And then we have striptease dancers as social housing providers, signing contracts.
I'm thinking, I can't help but think of that scene in The Wolf of Wall Street when he's beating his chair. You know, that one when he's in the restaurant. Yeah.
I think the reality with a lot of this stuff, it comes back down to greed. It's just all about greed. That's the reality. We got to a point where people could not get a return on their money and people started to get desperate. So you got motivated buyers in the market. And that goes across the board, from institutions to the small little investor that had 100K sat in their bank because their bounce back loan or whatever, furlough. From what and myself and Adam know these guys quite well because we bought from them previously as well. This is another REIT that we're talking about. They still haven't got it right. I've not seen personally a residential I'm going to call it second-hand property buying REIT in the UK get it right so far. It's been extremely, extremely difficult. And that's not because the model's not there. That's just because they can never find the operators to operate it really, really well. Whether that's the management side, whether that's the asset management side, and also whether that's the acquisitions. Because don't forget, trying to go to acquire a lot of these properties at the right money is the hardest part, I think, in the whole equation to begin with. So you either get the people that say, let's go the fancy route, which is build to rent, right? Because then they can cover over the fact that they don't need to buy a discount and they can try and get the land, try and get it at the early stages if possible, etc., etc. Or on the kind of other side of that, really, you start to get more people that go for the ground rents or the commercial properties, whatever, which is easier to manage as a whole. But I don't know about yourself, Adam. I'm sure you've got more experience about this, but have you ever seen someone get it right at a large scale? I mean, I'm talking about 2,000 units plus, second-hand properties we're talking about.
In the UK, I mean,
only the US now.
I suppose Granger. I suppose you'd have to consider that Grain. Although having said that, Granger have morphed over since they listed really into much more of the sort of company you were just talking about. But I think that was their bread and butter, and it did work, and they did get it to work. But of course, that's not the same as day one. I'm going to put together this team of 16 people. We're going to fund them with 100 million quid, and we're going to stand on the back of their neck until they've deployed it, which is much more of the pressure of the current day and the too much money problem and not enough places to house it. I mean, yeah, but apart from Granger,
Mount View.
In the US, obviously, there's examples. Saif was the one who first shared with me the story of the Blackstone funded. I can't remember the name of the company, Saif, but Dallas Tanner, is it? Is he the main man who was behind all of that?
Invitation Homes.
Invitation, that's it. And they did 50,000, didn't they? They did 50,000, and it was a classic, proper BMV trader cash buy on the way in, full refurb, crack team of refurbers. But I mean, now, today, trying to start that today when refurbs are twice the money that they were or whatever becomes really, really difficult. They did that at such a good time in the US market. And of course, they were able to IPO and all the rest of it because you got Blackstone behind you. So I'm not saying they achieved like phenomenal returns on their seed capital, but when you're Blackstone, if you can return 10% in bricks and mortar on seed capital, and I think they did better than that, but if you can return 10%, you're still pretty happy in the sort of post 2008 interest days. But you've got a big problem in that you were 18 months ago. I was saying property, and specifically residential property, is really the last bastion of any kind of return in the investment world in a big way. Now, park crypto on the side or whatever. I'm talking major established asset classes here. Yeah. So say you ran a pension fund, and here's your problem when you run a pension. Say that pension fund's got £1 billion in it, right? So it's a decent sized one. Yeah. You've got obligations for what could be all time, presuming the pension fund is still serving people who are in the workplace at the moment and taking on new entrants all the time. You've got a 100-year plus problem, right, to solve. Now that problem's quite easily quantifiable if your actuarial data is good. You know how many people are in it, you know how much they need to be paid. You know that it might be inflation-linked increases, so that might be part of your uncertainty, but you have to factor that into what you're investing in. If you go back to 1995, right, or 1985, then the vast majority of those obligations could easily be met by government bonds and corporate bonds. Those obligations absolutely could not be met by bonds in 2016 when the yields went down to 1%, right, broadly on government bonds, and a bit better on corporate. There was a lot of corporates that raised at under 2%, right? And I remember us talking, Saif, in probably 2020, when housing associations were raising bonds at 0.5% and things like that. That's how desperate people were to deploy. I mean, 0.5% not to a government. I appreciate it's underpinned by a government, but still, it's pretty unthinkable, right? Today, you can go out and deploy, and if you use your same logic, Saif, look at your portfolio as if you were paying 6% on the interest rates, right? If they looked at their portfolio today and say, hold on a second, we can get 5 on a bond, or 4 point something decent on a 10-year, or a 30-year, or a 50-year. Now, of course, they have a whole portfolio of investments that they can shift back from, and it's a bigger problem for the stock market than it is the property market, but they can shift back from some of the splits they've had of late, which has been more like 10 to 15% bonds, and some of those are junk because they've have to chase the returns, right? 60 or 70% equities, and the rest private equity and venture capital to try and squeeze the return they needed to pay the people they needed to pay. They can shift back to 90% bonds, right? And 10% we might try and do, we're going to try and do our best, but that meets our obligations for the next 30 years. So we'll hang up our boots. Where does that leave the stock market? And where does it leave the George Osborne master plan? And that is tongue in cheek, by the way, because it was a terrible, terrible plan. But the master plan saw the BlackRocks and the Blackstones of the world coming into the UK property market in a big way. And at the moment, when we've talked about build to rent a number of times on here, going back to those yields Piotr was mentioning, 3.5%, 4%, whatever, that's very much your sort of build to rent yield, right? Things aren't going to change to the tune where build to rent yields come up at 7 or 8. It's not happening because they're being built in the most desirable suburbs for people who have got good white collar jobs, who are young, so they're in the rental market, right? So now, based on the fact that the risk-free rate of return is up 450 to 500 basis points at the moment, and is probably up 350 basis points for a little while yet, then your 3.5% and 4% yields need to become 7 and 7.5%. Therefore, ergo, who starts? There was a good post. I don't know exactly where it was on Facebook. It might have been on his own profile. It might have been in his UK Property World group. But Will Mallard put up a good post saying, this is what Berkeley Homes are doing, right? And they're saying we're going to be very, very selective from now on in sites that we buy. They've got a land bank. They can develop that out. They can wait for a storm they think may or may not be coming. They don't have to. But I mean, any large company is under pressure to deploy funds and deliver the same sort of returns they always have, right? But they don't have to. So if they're making statements like that, which has got to be seen as talking down the market realistically for land, then what's really going to be going on? This is a semi, and don't get me wrong, we're already 9 months into it or whatever. What really happens, everybody worries about price. It's all terrible and blah, blah, blah. But in reality, just transaction volume dries up. Transaction volume dries up significantly. And then things that are tricky, nobody wants to take a chance on. And that's where the trader opportunities will always be, because there will always be the organic cycles of life, death, divorce. Although that got disrupted significantly during COVID, is back and is going to be back. To start with in a bigger way than it ever was, and then it's going to go back more into a steady state style situation. So it's not that opportunities aren't there, but it's more like, well, if the big boys aren't going to, if dear old George delivered that budget in June 2015, didn't he? So that's 8.25 years ago now, and it's been a pebble in a pond in the UK market. John Lewis announced, didn't they? Oh, these buildings we're doing, we're not really doing them because they don't stack up, apparently. It's like, duh, no kidding, really? I wonder how long it took you to do, how many tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of pounds you spent working that out, when we could have told you that in 5 minutes, that they wouldn't stack up because of what you were trying to do. And they certainly don't stack up in this interest rate environment. So, again, what's the impact? Fewer new builds, fewer rental properties, basic economics, you know, what did we see in COVID? You know, supply of sales went down massively because people sat on stuff because they were worried. There was plenty of stimulus, as you were saying, money that needed a home, from your 50 grand bounce backer to your 50 million pound private equity fund and beyond, right? What did they do? They pumped money in, and what happened to price? It went up like that. Now you're in the same position in the rental market where supply is drying, it's tightening, and supply of new stock, that's not being fixed for the next 12 months. And that's a very, when will it be fixed? Who knows at this stage? And how will it be fixed? Difficult to tell you, but it would require some political union, and it would require Acorn and Shelter not trying to firebomb landlords, but to work with them. So look forward to when that ever happens, right? And so you're just going to see that price pressure just meteorically rise, and yields will, in that way, the market is acting underneath all of that to force the yields up, to say, please come back into the market, because we need, and look at these returns you can now get. You know, it's the old invisible hand, and it's how the market works. It's just textbook economics. That's why I love it so much.
It's one of these, you've got to be careful what you wish for, right? Because these pressure groups against, like, you know, Act Now, homeless, and all this other thing, and obviously Shelter and et al, all the other things that you hear, is they're getting exactly what they want. They're putting adverse pressure against landlords in an adverse environment, and it is only going to affect tenants adversely. I mean, a landlord may have to take a 10% hit on the sale price, but they probably owned it for X number of years. They're probably quids in, they probably drawn down against the assets a couple of times, whatever it is. But it's the tenants that are going to be feeling the pinch of this. And then you're going to, you know, likelihood of seeing homelessness increase is real. The likelihood that we're going to see people moving back home with parents or grandparents or other older family members is going to increase.
I've got the dreaded device overheating message, so I may well leave you unexpectedly very shortly, gents. So too much hot air, obviously, blown towards it. I do apologise.
You've only had 64%, Adam. If you do not fulfil your contractual obligations, we will be forced to proceed with an official legal letter.
The asset managers will be in, will they? Yeah, the asset managers will be in.
Okay, it's interesting you said that. The WhatsApp group that I'm in with Adam as well, there's someone that posted saying there's people going around knocking on doors of houses, speaking to tenants and saying, look, if you've got a bit of mold here, a bit of mold there, we will go out and obviously do a claim against your landlord, blah, 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 etc., etc. So they actually did that effectively. But actually, who loses there is the tenant, because they will be making the majority of that. So say, for example, whatever, it's an X amount of money, they'll be making around 70-80% of that claim on a no-win, no-fee style thing. And they're almost acting or represent as if they're representing the council. So they're going knocking on doors, and it's very, very believable, saying, you know, we're working with the council. If you've got even a small bit of mold, this, that, and the other, and that's just going to cause more problems for tenants, because it's going to cause more, obviously, landlords to sell up. But anyway, we've got a 7-minute countdown until we get to 55 minutes past. And I think maybe that's why Adam got scared and had to end up leaving. He
knew what was coming. We got some really interesting comments from Guy Charlison. Guy, thanks for putting the comments in. One of them is about the pension companies, and Guy says, for those of you who can't read the comments, interesting point about pension companies, they have liked freehold ground rent. I wonder what pressure they're putting on the government against the ground rent reforms that are going to be presented in the King's speech.
Yeah.
What do you guys think about that?
I mean, I think it's like anything really, isn't it? Obviously, the big boys always have some kind of political power, you know, or political sway, as they say. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, obviously, you know, the governments generally, from a political point of view, never really want to upset them, because they might be the ones supporting them in one way, shape or form, whether it's financially or, you know, through one way or another. So I think it's going to have a sway on how they look at things. But also, likewise, if they are set on doing something, which I think they are, then potentially it might still go ahead anyway. And the reality is the consequences are going to have to be felt by everyone, whether you're a small freehold owner or whether you're a large freehold owner. You know, it's just something that they're going to be setting in stone. Similar to kind of the the rent reform, you know, yes, they've changed it around a few bits and they have tweaked it, but it's still coming into play, because if they don't, then that's going to be seen as a major weakness from the government. The fact that they always say a lot of things and don't do it, but the reality is they can tweak it, but they still need to be able to do it at the end of the day. That's my kind of thought process.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess there will also be like things like that will probably get somehow handled close to some sort of election period when it's going to be really favorable for the party, to whatever party, to actually act on this and make it happen.
Yeah, and then the other party will kick the can down the road, as they always do.
Yeah. Another interesting comment from Guy: I used to act for Bradford Property Trust when they were largest owner of residential property. They, of course, got taken over by Granger. I think that's really interesting because I guess in America, everything, pretty much everyone tries to be listed and be on the stock exchange market. But I think in the UK, there's actually a lot of housing association type companies, which are pretty much like the US listed companies, but they just act like a housing association on paper, but they're still there to make profit, and they're the largest, like massively large companies basically. And there's like Northumberland and Durham Property Trust. There is like Notting Hill Housing Association. So many housing associations that I think on paper act like a housing association, but in reality they're pretty much like development companies, pretty much like asset managing companies basically, that are there to make profits or make some sort of gains for some companies that are probably connected. That's my impression of the market.
A lot of M&A happens in this space as well. So a lot of M&A, mergers and acquisitions, happen specifically within this kind of sector, because ultimately we don't, you know, yes, although we do have a lot of REITs that have been spun into IPOs, but in the same token, I think a lot of these companies want to stay quite private because they're getting government backing or whatever it is. But a lot of these companies will prefer to buy up smaller companies or merge with sort of similar size companies and grow to become bigger and better, and maybe IPO at some stage in the future. Whereas I think in America, the first thing they always have in their mind is IPO straight away, because they want to raise funds, or, you know, sometimes a lot of these people get into it with a mindset of 7 years. And 7 years, in order to try and pay back investors, have a liquidity event, is pretty much IPO majority of the time. So yeah, interesting to see.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, and another comment from Guy: my understanding is that there are few lenders who lend for property led to Circle. I think it's kind of like most people in the market know now that Circle properties are very much a cash buying kind of territory, and whoever is buying them at the yields that sellers are asking for, which they are asked for like 10%, 11% maybe, like it's still an overinflated price for those properties, even at those yields. But
yeah, they're still very much lending on bricks and mortar. So there are lenders out there that will do Circle properties. The reasoning why lenders don't like generally asylum or supported or whatever is because they don't want to end up having a PR nightmare where they're having to evict vulnerable tenants and obviously be seen as evicting vulnerable tenants. However, I know there's a few lenders where if you amend there's certain things they want you to amend in the lease, and Circle will allow you to do that. If you amend the Circle lease, there's lenders that will lend on that, but the valuation is very much bricks and mortar, not on a commercial, just to be really clear. And actually the rates are pretty much in line with the rest of the rates. So you're not looking at those specialist together type lenders. It's actually what I call more, not necessarily vanilla, but the challenger banks basically that would still do it at the 6% and whatever. So there are lenders out there, and they're opening that up more and more, but the lease has to be tweaked accordingly, which Circle being one of them, they will allow that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we are reaching the mark of 9:55. Pretty much. It's been rather entertaining chat today, even though we lost Adam 5 minutes before the time. But yeah, just to say thanks for joining and stepping in to chat about all those interesting subjects that are happening in the market. And as usual, we'll be back next week. Thanks everyone for interacting. Have an amazing Sunday, and we'll chat with you next week.
Take care, guys. See you later.